the press plays an incredibly important role during these protests. It's essential for the public to be able to see what's going on, to know what's happening, and for police to be held accountable as to how they are treating protesters.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. A quick reminder, we'll be hosting 2 sessions at the upcoming Northeast Media Literacy Conference being held online November 6th and 7th. The first class is going to feature Emily Sweeney and Jennifer Peters, both of the Boston Globe and board members of NEFAC. They'll be teaching media literacy from a journalist perspective, providing suggestions and tips on how to best vet information that's found online. We'll also be hosting Dan Kennedy, a media expert and professor of journalism at Northeastern University. Dan will be explaining to us where he thinks journalism as a profession and an industry is headed. You can learn more and register for the conference at nefac.org. Today, I'm with Stephen Brown, Executive Director of the ACLU of Rhode Island. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Justin. Glad to talk with you.
Stephen, during the last several weeks, there have been a number of political demonstrations and protests happening in Providence and surrounding towns. There's been a large police presence at each. Force has been used, some would argue excessive force. More recently, arrests have been made of peaceful protesters, legal observers. Journalists have been tear gassed in some instances. Can you bring us up to speed here? Tell us what prompted these protests and how they played out.
Sure. The protests have been going on for some time now. They started a month or so ago. There was the Breonna Taylor incident. Obviously, the George Floyd incident has been playing out here in Rhode Island as it has across the country. So the protests have been pretty persistent. Different organizations have been responsible for putting them together. And just recently, in the last week, protests have arisen as a result of an incident that occurred here in Providence, where a young man on a moped was chased by police, ended up with very serious injuries, is in a coma at the hospital. It's unclear exactly what happened. Some believe that this police cruiser chased the moped and actually hit it, forcing this young man to fly off the moped and have serious injuries. And that has prompted almost daily protests in the last week. And what we've seen, unfortunately, is that police, it's sometimes been the Providence police, the Rhode Island State Police, have, rather than de-escalate these protests, have engaged in activity that is very troubling. As you've indicated, they've used pepper spray, it seems almost indiscriminately, against some protesters. About a few weeks ago at one of the protests, an online reporter was recording what was going on, and a state police trooper told him to go away, or he'd be arrested. So this is something that's ongoing. It's certainly very troubling. There have been a number of arrests of individuals for what appear to be peaceful protesting. So we're trying to go through. I mean, there's just so much going on. We've received complaints from some of the individuals who have been arrested. We're looking into it to try to figure out, what's the best way to respond.
Yeah, in fact, we just had a presentation involving someone from the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker who gave us a broader national perspective as far as force against journalists. And she said, there's no question about it. There's been this clear uptick in excessive use used against journalists on the scene covering these types of demonstrations. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that journalist that you mentioned here in Providence, who had the experience with law enforcement. Can you give us some more details about what happened there and what kind of force was used?
Yeah, sure. So this was a protest occurring in Providence. Protesters actually surrounded a police vehicle that was there while they were protesting. Police got out, started telling everybody to disperse. And again, just almost indiscriminately, one state trooper just began using pepper spray against the crowd as it was actually moving away from the police officers. This one individual, Will James, who's a reporter for an online reporting service, Uprise Rhode Island, was the only journalist covering this protest. None of the mainstream media were there at the time, and he was just recording. And the officer who, I think it was the officer who had pepper sprayed before, told him to go away. And he stood his ground. He said, "Look, I'm a reporter. I'm here to report on this. I'm recording." And ultimately, the officer said, "Go away," he said, "I don't care. Go away, or I'm going to arrest you." So it's just there was just no interest whatsoever in this trooper in caring whether or not this person was a journalist, was a protester, was somebody engaged in illegal activity. It was all the same to him. Go away, or I'll arrest you. And that's not how the First Amendment is supposed to work.
So let's talk about that for a moment, because I'm sure there are going to be people that are hearing this conversation between the two of us, and they're envisioning a group of protesters surrounding a police cruiser, and they're going to be asking themselves, well, why shouldn't the police have a right to indiscriminately use pepper spray or pepper balls to disperse the crowd? Shouldn't they have that right, regardless of who's there, to keep the peace? What would you say in response, Stephen?
Well, I mean, certainly at the very beginning, the police had an interest in dispersing the crowd. If there's a crowd that's preventing a police cruiser from moving along, police have a legitimate interest in dealing with this. The problem is police get out of the car, the crowd starts dispersing, and the police then indiscriminate, again, key word is indiscriminate. Sure, police have the authority and ability to deal with somebody who is engaged in violent activity at the time. But once the problem seems to have been resolved, to just indiscriminately spray people with a serious chemical irritant is very troubling, because at that point, all that people are doing is engaging in First Amendment activity. They're engaged in peaceful protest at that point. There's no need to be escalating the situation by the use of pepper spray, and certainly none whatsoever with this particular journalist who was just monitoring, watching what was happening, clearly was not engaged in any illegal activity. The press plays an incredibly important role during these protests. It's essential for the public to be able to see what's going on, to know what's happening, and for police to be held accountable as to how they are treating protesters. So when the police attempt to intimidate journalists, reporters who are covering these sorts of activities, we all suffer if we can't get that information from people on the scene, trying to monitor what's going on and make sure that illegal activity isn't taking place by the police themselves.
For sure. The role of journalists right now, I think, is so important, because they're out there in ways that many of us just cannot be, or wouldn't otherwise be. There are eyes, our ears. They're there to not only document and bear witness to many of these protests and the demands for social change, but also to document how police are acting, how they're responding, and if force is being used, is it being used reasonably or excessively or unnecessarily, like it sounds like it was in this case. And as I mentioned, we work with the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker and other advocates as far as protecting the rights of journalists, and that's often a focus of ours. But I think sometimes what goes missing is that the First Amendment doesn't just protect journalists; it protects all citizens, right? And there are protesters that are out there that are being peaceful and nonviolent and demonstrating in ways that they have every right to, but are still being told to disperse and get out of the area, these public areas that they have a right to be in. So, from your perspective with the ACLU, Stephen, when you hear of situations like this, when Rhode Island residents are in public streets simply expressing themselves politically, and met with a line of police officers, shooting tear gas at them, what is your ultimate concern for all citizens, not just journalists, but every Rhode Island citizen and resident that's out in the streets protesting?
Well, the ultimate concern is that it has a significant deterrent effect on people being able to exercise their First Amendment rights. There's a lot going on in our country right now. There's a lot to protest about legitimately, and our country suffers if people cannot exercise their right to protest. It's absolutely essential for a free society to allow people to peacefully express their views, whether it's writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor, or going out on the streets to protest an injustice that people have seen. And anytime that the police try to squelch that sort of activity, it's a real undermining of basic principles of what a free society is all about.
So what do we do if we're about to go join a protest, or if we're a journalist who's about to go cover one? Do you have any quick advice or suggestions, some guidance that you could give those individuals on not only how to keep safe, but if you're a journalist, how you can best do your job without getting pepper sprayed or arrested?
Yeah, well, one of the really disturbing aspects of what we've seen across the country, and you've mentioned how there are organizations tracking the way journalists have been treated covering these protests. I think one of the really disturbing things that I've seen in reading about some of these incidents is that police have targeted journalists with pepper spray, or even with rubber bullets, when it's clear that they're members of the press. They're wearing badges that show they're press members, and the police don't care. So how do you deal with that if you're making it clear you're a member of the press, they know you're a member of the press, and yet they feel emboldened enough to still target you? Honestly, I'm not sure what sort of advice to give, other than hopefully try to do your job, but stay as safe as you can. But you're performing an incredibly important public service by trying to cover what's going on. But I really don't know how you respond when police start actually targeting journalists. And in the case that happened here in Providence a few weeks ago, it wasn't as serious as has happened elsewhere, but the attitude of the police was the same. It was, I don't care if you're a journalist, get out of here. To the extent you can be brave, be brave. Don't be too brave, though. I mean, there's no need to put yourself in a position to harm yourself. But to the extent you can, you're performing an important public service, monitoring what the police are doing, and the public needs to know if journalists are being targeted. And one of the results is there have been a number of lawsuits across the country. The ACLU is currently involved in a few of those. I know the ACLU is representing journalists in Portland, Oregon, representing journalists in Minneapolis, where journalists have been targeted. I know there are other lawsuits as well. I mean, I guess that's one ultimate solution to the problem, is holding the police accountable in the courts, but it shouldn't get to that point in the first place. I mean, that's what's so troubling.
Absolutely. I say it all the time. It's an unfortunate reality that we're in. Whereas when you're covering, as a journalist, when you're covering these events and police are telling you to leave, you can't just hold up a copy of the Constitution and say, "Hey, but my First Amendment rights." Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You either comply in most cases, or you're met with the wrong end of a baton or
Yes.
pepper spray. Unfortunately, the remedy most often comes after the fact by reaching out to groups like NEFAC or the ACLU. But going in, obviously you want to prepare yourself as much as you can, and ultimately just stay safe while doing your job. On NEFAC's end, we have a number of resources, including a video that we just produced that you can find at nefac.org, about how to stay safe as a journalist when you're not only covering these types of political demonstrations, but also being in the community during this ongoing pandemic, and other considerations to make as you're going through your job, news gathering. Stephen, any resources you can point people to as far as the ACLU in Rhode Island is concerned?
Well, for journalists, I'd certainly refer them to NEFAC. You're a great resource for journalists who are facing problems when they're out in the streets trying to cover these things. Any protesters that feel their rights are violated. The ACLU is here. Obviously, we have a long history of filing lawsuits defending the right to protest. We're looking at some of the complaints we've received in these past few weeks as a result of the protests that have occurred, and we're trying to determine, what litigation or other options are available. But people who feel that their First Amendment rights have been violated should feel free to contact us.
And what's the best way to do so, Stephen?
Well, they can do it either by calling us 401-831-7171 or sending us an email at info@riaclu.org.
That's great. I would encourage everybody to do so. Again, I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I can be reached at justin@nefac.org. Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, telling us a bit about what's going on in Providence and providing the resources that you have.
Thanks for letting me talk about it. What's a very important issue.